Hi, it's Katrina. My friend David is going to be helping me out with the voiceover today, so I hope you enjoy.
Number 10. The 1492 expulsion. The leaders of the church were behind the horrific massacre of 1391, and they were also behind another terrible event that took place in Spain in 1492. The same year, Christopher Columbus made his journey to the New World. But what they don't teach you in school is that just days before Columbus set sail, religious fanaticism endorsed by the church resulted in one of the greatest religious evacuations in history. The Alhambra Decree was issued on March 31st, 1492. It was officiated by Catholic monarchs in Spain, and it ordered the expulsion of any practicing Jewish person from Castile and Aragon. Every Jew was forced to either leave Spain or convert to Catholicism by July 31st, only 5 days before Columbus set sail. Following the horrific events of 1391, around half of Spain's Jewish population had already converted to Catholicism. By 1415, an estimated 50,000 more converted because of the continuous attacks they endured. With the Alhambra Decree, roughly 200,000 Jews converted to Catholicism in order to remain in Spain, and 100,000 more were kicked out of the country. The expulsion was a huge event that led to a chain reaction of migration, with Jews flooding Italy, Greece, Turkey, and other places in Europe. The church was fully behind the expulsion, but it took the monarchs of Spain about 10 years to get the Vatican behind their decision. The monarchs were afraid of the potential influence Jews may have had on the population. They wanted to ensure that their institutions were not overrun with Judaism and that they could remain in power. It wasn't until 1968 that the Vatican finally revoked the decree. Number 9. The Massacre of 1391. The Spanish Inquisition was one of the most horrendous things ever executed by the Church. However, it all started many decades earlier with the Massacre of 1391. This was a savage display of anti-Semitic violence in Spain and the peak of one of the worst outbreaks of anti-Semitism in Europe during the Middle Ages. In the 14th century, Jewish people living in the Iberian Peninsula were not universally liked. In fact, they were downright hated. This was mainly because the Catholic Church pushed a narrative that the Jewish people were responsible for the crucifixion of Christ. Even though the Church teaches that Jesus Christ died specifically for the sins of humanity, meaning he was always meant to die, they still blamed the Jews. This led to anti-Semitism and violence. Between 1350 and 1365, Pedro I, also known as Peter the Cruel, was the King of Castile in Spain. He was a protector of the Jews and fought for their rights, especially after 3 separate massacres in 1355, 1360, and 1366. But in 1369, he was murdered by his half-brother, and suddenly the royal protection was gone. Then came the Archdeacon of Esca, Ferrand Martinez. He incited hate against the Jewish people on behalf of the Church. He criticized them harshly and demanded that authorities begin removing them from the population. This ended in the tragedy of 1391. About 4,000 Jews in Seville had their houses attacked and destroyed, and the rest were bullied into converting to Christianity. The violence began in Seville, but spread across the kingdom, which resulted in an estimated 50,000 deaths over just 3 months. Number 8. The Power of the Witch. Starting in the 16th century, witch hunts became a serious problem in Europe. The Great Hunt, as historians call it, was a phenomenon that lasted between 1560 and 1630. For about 70 years, witch hunters accused about 80,000 people of witchcraft, which led to roughly 40,000 deaths. But why did this happen, and how did it start? According to expert economist Peter Leeson, it was just business. Peter believes that witchcraft paranoia started because of the division in the church. Both the Protestant and Catholic churches persecuted witches, and they used their high numbers of successful executions to lure in potential followers. More simply, each church practiced the persecution of witches to make them look more effective at protecting people from Satan. Witchcraft wasn't seen as an issue prior to the 15th century. From between 900 AD and 1400, the church didn't acknowledge the existence of witches at all. Because the church didn't believe in hocus pocus and magic, they didn't kill people for witchcraft. Such a thing was prohibited in 1258 by Pope Alexander IV. It wasn't until the Protestant Reformation that the prohibition of persecuting witches was turned around. The church suddenly admitted witches were real, and it was all because they were losing members. The witch hunts were all part of a plan to convince people that the Catholic Church was the right place to be. Number 7. the horror of the Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition began in 1478 and would continue for almost 400 years. The purpose of this institution was to combat the spread of heresy in Spain. However, what really happened was that Spain used the church to consolidate power within the newly unified Spanish kingdoms of Castile and Aragon. The Spanish Inquisition, established by the Roman Catholic Church, resulted in widespread death, chaos, and unimaginable suffering. When it began, Spain was unique in the European world. The country was multicultural, with a large population of Muslims and Jews. This is because the Moorish people had occupied Spain and Portugal starting in the 8th century, but they lost all their power in the 14th century. With the Catholics on top once again, the monarchy was desperate to remove any potential threats, including those of other religions. The first people to participate in the Spanish Inquisition were so brutal that Pope Sixtus IV tried to cancel the whole institution. But it was too late, and the wheels were already moving. In 1483, the Pope authorized the government of Spain to name someone as the Grand Inquisitor. Tomás de Torquemada was subsequently given this title, and his name soon became synonymous with torture and pain. In his short tenure as Grand Inquisitor, Tomás de Torquemada had an estimated 2,000 people burned at the stake. He also had a hand in the Alhambra Decree and the expulsion of Jews in 1492. Number 6. Burning Joan of Arc. The burning of Joan of Arc was a truly dark point in the history of the Church. Joan was born in France to a farmer in 1412. 3 years after her birth, the 100 Years' War entered one of its most important phases. England's King Henry V invaded France, and he won multiple battles. This left the French in serious trouble. By 1422, the English controlled most of northern France, which included Paris. It was around that time when a young girl named Joan began to hear voices in her head. She was only 16 years old when she claimed that Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, and Saint Margaret were whispering inside her brain. The saints supposedly told Joan that she needed to help capture the city of Reims and help protect the French throne. She set out on her mission to save France in May of 1428. Through sheer determination, the teenage farm girl soon became a warrior and leader of men. She led the charge into multiple battles after convincing generals and even soon-to-be King Charles that she was sent by God to be the savior of the country. She inspired the French people and took the city of Orleans on May 8, 1428. Over the next 5 weeks, she continued to pull in victories over the English until Charles VII was crowned King of France. Sadly, in 1430, she was captured by the English and was arrested. She was put on trial and eventually sentenced to death for refusing to submit to the church. This led to her being burned at the stake as a heretic on May 30th, 1431, at only 19 years old. Do you think Joan of Arc really heard voices that urged her to protect the French throne? Or do you think she just wanted to get in on the action and use that as a way for people to trust her? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and while you're at it, hit that subscribe button. Number 5. The Crusades. One of the defining events of the Middle Ages was the initiation of the Crusades in the 11th century. This religious war went on for roughly 200 years and is considered an extremely evil time in the Church's history. The Crusades began in November of 1095. Pope Urban II in France asked all of the Western Christians to take up arms against the Muslims in the Eastern Roman Empire so that they could recapture the Holy Land. The First Crusade was from between 1096 to 1099, resulting in the fall of Jerusalem. The First Crusade was a major success for the Catholic Church. The leaders of the Church promised that every crusader who fought for the kingdom of God would get into heaven for free. Those who died in battle would be granted access to paradise, just like Viking warriors being accepted into Valhalla. As a result, the entire continent full of bloodthirsty men thought they could get away with heinous war crimes because they were doing it for the Catholic Church. With every crusade, it got less about toppling Muslim forces in the Holy Land and more about silencing enemies of the Catholic Church. The final crusades were fought between 1208 and 1271, and were aimed specifically at rooting out heretics at home in Europe. The Albigensian Crusade was fought in France, and the Baltic Crusades between 1211 and 1225 took place in Transylvania against pagans. People kept showing up to these battles because they were promised free tickets to heaven. Soldiers were allowed to kill and pillage without fear of punishment, basically carrying out the Church's dirty bidding. Number 4. The Malus Maleficarum. The Malus Maleficarum was a manual on witch hunting that was written in Latin and was presented to the University of Cologne in 1487. The title translates into English as The Hammer of Witches. It was written by James Sprenger and Henry Kramer as a detection manual for those practicing witchcraft. Back then, if you suspected someone was in cahoots with the devil, you would look to this book as a guide. It was used for the next 300 years and had a major impact on witch trials throughout Europe. People seemed to believe it back then, but this book was really just a work of fiction, and yet it became as important to Europeans as a law book. Ways for potential witches to be tortured and killed were detailed, and specific evidence for witchcraft was outlined in the Malus Maleficarum. Most frightening of all was that the book revealed exactly how to identify a witch, and it was not ideal for a lot of people. It said a woman was a witch if she had a strange birthmark, if she lived alone, if she acted peculiar, or if she cultivated medicine. The potential for a woman being a witch was so broad that many people used the book just to kill their wives or to get rid of their annoying neighbors. Number 3. The Demonic Pope. Pope Boniface VIII is considered by many historians to be the least saintly pope in history. He was the head of the Catholic Church from December 1294 until his death in 1303. After the unexpected abdication of Pope Celestine V, Boniface became the Vatican's 193rd pope. The details of his rule are controversial at best. This is because Pope Boniface got into a feud with King Philip of Spain, causing negative rumors to circulate about the pope. It's difficult to say for certain which rumors were true and which were false. Boniface supposedly imprisoned the pope before him for 10 months until Celestine keeled over and died. He also allegedly had incestuous relations with his own children. He was repeatedly adulterous and even had an issue with young boys. After he became pope, he built statues of himself all over Rome and began taking bribes for seats in the church. He was so evil that when Dante Alighieri wrote the Divine Comedy, he reserved a special place for Boniface in the 8th circle of hell. Number 2. The Salem Witch Trials. The Salem Witch Trials took place in Massachusetts and began in the early part of 1692. To this day, it's one of the most shocking examples of religious paranoia and fanaticism in American history. At least 200 people were accused of practicing the devil's magic, and 20 of them went on to be horrifically executed. Less than 2 decades later, in 1711, authorities pardoned many of the accused and gave them compensation. But it wasn't until July of 2022 that the last convicted Salem witch, Elizabeth Johnson, was finally exonerated. The trouble in Salem was directly caused by the witch fever that swept through Europe at the end of the 1600s. When the Europeans finally stopped burning their witches, Salem decided to pick up the torch. In 1689, England went to war with France in the American colonies, causing a surge of colonists to show up in Salem village. There were too many people living in a small and cramped village, and those already in Salem were angry at the newcomers. This led to major tension between the original inhabitants of the village and the new arrivals. In 1692, when the daughter of Reverend Samuel Parris began to have strange fits, he blamed witches. Another girl named Anne Putnam Jr. also started convulsing, and she too was accused of witchcraft. However, the witch hunts in Salem began due to the lingering paranoia that started in Europe. It's also believed that since there were so many migrants living in such a small village, the locals began to lose their minds. Number 1. John Wycliffe. John Wycliffe was an English priest who was largely responsible for the build-up of the Protestant Reformation that would sweep across Europe. He grew up in the mid-1300s, at a time when the Holy Roman Catholic Church reigned supreme. They had already split into the Western Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church, but this only seemed to double their power. As an educated theologian and priest, John was vocal about the Church's abuses, and he challenged the hierarchy. He was even bold enough to say that the Scriptures were the supreme authority, not the Pope. He claimed the Church had strayed far from its original purpose and needed a desperate correction. The Church didn't like people saying this stuff, especially those who were getting the attention of the masses. After he died of a stroke in 1384, John was brutalized by the Church, and they condemned him as a heretic in 1415. His remains were later dug up and buried. Then his ashes were thrown into the river by angry Catholics. What do you think is the single most horrific thing ever perpetrated by the Church? Let us know your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Bye.